Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. Should I use this mic or this mic? I'm fine? Okay. I have to tell you, when I first moved to Washington, D.C., I was invited. I guess I was already, I hadn't just moved there, but I had become the director of this small museum, and I was invited to an informal Sunday brunch at some mucky muck's house. And it said informal, so I was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, jeans and a shirt, but the last minute it was autumn, it was cold. I took a jacket, and I was glad I did because, of course, I was the only male there not wearing a gray suit and tie. So just so you know, I'm from Washington, I'm wearing a tie. My topic this evening, finding spirituality through art in the modern world, three perspectives, has as a starting point the observation regarding religion that its point and purpose has always been to try to connect us back to something other than ourselves, which as far back as we can trace ourselves as a species, we have believed has something to do with our existence, has made us. And having created us, it can destroy us. It can help us, harm us, further us, hinder us, bless us, curse us. It is the point and purpose of religion to find a way to be connected to what we might call God, or what we might call the gods, or whatever term or terms that we use refers to that other reality. And the word religion itself reflects that. It comes from a Latin base. L vowel G in Latin is a binding, and RE in Latin is back or again. The IO suffix indicates that it's an abstract noun. So religio, religion, is that which binds us back to that other. Within religion, as we follow its history, and if we are speaking, as I am this evening, of the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions, so the Abrahamic religions, within religion, there is a kind of subset, I guess I'd put it, called mysticism. And within mysticism, or rather mysticism as a subset, is first of all a kind of more intensified sensibility than is true for garden variety religion. And furthermore, the mystic is defined as someone who believes that there is a deeper, hiddenmost recess to that other with which he or she can somehow connect, called the mysterion. That's a Greek word, and it means hiddenness. It comes from a verb mystein, which means to close, or by extension, to hide. So that which is hidden within God itself, that everyday religion doesn't access, mysticism claims to be able to do so, even as it recognizes that that's an impossibility, because after all, God is God and we are we, and how can the two connect? And yet the mystic believes that it's possible, which, by the way, means you should not engage in the mystical enterprise unless you're completely comfortable with paradox. There are dangers. If you manage to transcend yourself to become one with that, can you come back? If you come back, can you explain what the experience was? How can you? Our experience, when we speak, uses words, and words are by definition part of our reality in the here and now, and that other reality, being other, transcends words. So how can I describe what the experience was if I had the experience? The poster child for that problem is a Muslim mystic, a Sufi by the name of, his name just went out of my head, Muhammad al-Mansur, who around the year 922 came out of a condition of being outside himself, ecstasy, and he's screaming, Ana al-Haq, Ana al-Haq, Ana al-Haq. Haq is Arabic for truth, but it's also one of the 99 names for God. So he's saying, I am God, I am God, I am God. And of course the authorities look at that simply as a statement of apostasy, and he ends up executed. What they could not understand, because they were insensitive to the mystical enterprise, was that his condition was one of having been completely emptied of himself and become filled with God. And in coming back from that experience, he couldn't get the self back. It was still God speaking through him. And that's what said Ana al-Haq, not Mansur al-Haraj, but God itself speaking through him. So one might say of the mystical enterprise that it has as its point, its purpose, and its goal in becoming one with God as a kind of methodology of how can I become one with God, one with this deep hiddenmost recess, the mysterion. One of the obvious criteria for my ability to do that is to empty myself of self. The danger is that I can't get the self back, that I drop dead, that I go crazy, that I apostatize. But the other side of emptying myself of self is that I may recognize that the notion that my religion is the only correct religion, that there's only one path to God and it's my path, is a reflection of my ego and neither of God nor of what it is that is present within my religion. So mysticism, aside from being an intense subset of everyday religion, is an aspect of religious sensibility in which the opportunity is exponentially greater than is ordinarily the case to be both whatever one is, be it Jewish, be it Christian, be it Muslim, be it whatever subset of those three Abrahamic subdivisions one is, and at the same time universalist, recognizing that the number of paths to God is endless, and that what works for me and makes for me my form perfect and the best for me doesn't necessarily work for someone else. So what I want to speak about this evening, very briefly, is three individuals in the 20th, 21st centuries who have reflected on that quality in what they wrote about and what they taught about, and turned from that to just three images, three works of art, also from the late 20th, early 21st century, that are part of that sort of sensibility. Having said which, I start just in chronological terms with Martin Buber, a Jewish philosopher theologian, who grew up, by the way, in the late 19th, early 20th century as a very secular Jew. He was not overly interested in religion, and who, as a PhD project, became very interested in Hinduism and Buddhism. And as a consequence of that, he found himself more interested in general terms in spirituality. And as a consequence of that, he became one of the most important explorers of the late phase of Jewish mysticism called Hasidism, and one of the key figures in presenting and interpreting what that aspect of mysticism is about. He wrote about many other things, of course, but his most famous work, a kind of seminal work in 20th century thinking, is a work called I and Thou, or I and You. Ich und Du, he was writing in German. And in that work, he starts out by making the observation, and I'm now going to quote from him, that to man the world is twofold. There are two primary words, as he puts it, reflecting two primary attitudes that we have toward the world. One primary word is the combination I-thou. The other primary word is the combination I-it, wherein without a change in the primary word, one of the words he and she can also replace it. I-he, I-she. Hence, the I of man is also twofold. For the I of the primary word I-thou is a different I from the primary word I-it. The primary word I-thou can only be spoken with the whole being. The primary word I-it can never be spoken with the whole being. There is no I taken in itself, but only the I of the primary word I-thou and the I of the primary word I-it. And he goes on to observe that the primary word I-thou establishes the world of relation. The primary word I-it establishes the world of experience. In I-it, I experience the world. In I-thou, I have a relationship with the world. In I-thou, I recognize that you're thou, you who are thou to me are I to you, and I am a thou to you. It's reciprocal. It's a completed circle. In I-it, I see you as something outside myself for myself, and don't acknowledge the I that you are. And he goes on to observe that the spheres in which the world of relationship arises are three. First, our life with nature. There the relation always is in gloom beneath the level of speech. So I can have an I-thou relationship with my dog. I can have an I-thou relationship with my pet rock. The idea is that if it's I-thou, the possibility of relating in a reciprocal, completed circle kind of mode is there. So my dog or my rock or a tree outside my window doesn't have to be an it that I experience for myself. That's the self. But I, thou, it becomes circular. Second, our life with humans, where the relation is open and in the form of speech. We can give and accept the thou. Well, that's the most obvious form of such a relationship. So with people, we have but always the choice, I, it, I, thou. We have a relationship or we don't. I experience you. I look down upon you in some fundamental, emotional, psychological, spiritual sense in I, it. I, thou, it's always a level playing field because your thou is also your I and my thou is also my I. Third, our life with spiritual beings. There the relation is clouded, yet it discloses itself. It does not use speech, yet begets it. We perceive no thou, but nonetheless we feel we are addressed and we answer. In every sphere in its own way, through each process of becoming that is present to us, we look out toward the fringe of the eternal thou. In all this, it can be about, all of this can come about if I have both will and grace. So he argues in the three parts of this book, one, introducing the subject and briefly noting the relationship that one can have with nature. The second part, extensively exploring the human relationship of I, thou. The third part is the notion of a relationship with God. That's what he's talking about, of course, spiritual beings. He's writing in an era, this was around 1930 or so, when secularism is rife. He's also writing in an era when one of the more enduring, popular, and expanding schools of thought, existentialism, was very much around. Existentialism posits that everything that I do out of my own free will, because there is no God that is looking over my shoulder telling me how to be or what to think or what to say or what to do. What he has come up with is a form of religious existentialism, a paradox. Existentialism is anti-religion. His is religious existentialism, because he says, by my act of will, for a moment, I can will myself to suspend my disbelief in God's existence. And when that happens, I will find God on the other side of this I-thou equation and find myself involved in a relationship that I didn't know possible until I willed myself to suspend the disbelief so that it could become possible. So the thing about Buber, of course, is there's nothing specifically Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, there's nothing specific. It is a vision which is a universalist vision of how one can, even as an existentialist, an atheist, suspend one's atheism and then find oneself embedded in a relationship with God that mirrors the kinds of relationship which in the ideal one has with humans, which is also mirrored in the kind of relationship one has in the beings on our planet that are not human. Thomas Merton, writing about 30 years later, was a Christian mystic who found his way to the mystical tradition through a kind of back door that also began with a very atheistic perspective. His parents were Protestant and Catholic respectively, but he lost both of them at a relatively young age. And when he was about 20, found himself in Rome, and he had his father's Bible. And he kind of picked it up, and his eye fell almost arbitrarily on some passages that caused him to think and rethink his whole relationship to divinity, which had been non-existent up to that point. And to make a very long story short with respect to his biography, he ends up as a mystic, he ends up in a monastery, he ends up as a monk, but he also finds himself compelled, and he wonders whether it's too egotistical, and maybe he shouldn't do this, to write, because he feels he's got things to express. And his abbot says, no, no, this is your gift, you have to. You have to share with the world, because that will help the world understand what we're about, it will help us understand what we're about. And as he began to write and as he began to explore more of the world of the spiritual, beyond the walls of his monastery, he found himself increasingly interested in non-Christian and particularly Hinduism and Buddhism, but in particularly Buddhism, but non-Christian forms of faith, because he kept finding correlations. And he found no contradiction between the emphatic and very clear-cut Christianity that defined him, and at the same time, his sense of complete comfort with other forms of faith as well. And one of the things he wrote in 1962 in a work called New Seeds of Contemplation sounds like this. I cannot treat, the subtitle of this portion of his essay is called We Are One. I cannot treat other men as men unless I have compassion for them. I must have at least enough compassion to realize that when they suffer, they feel somewhat as I do when I suffer. And if for some reason I do not spontaneously feel this kind of sympathy for others, then it is God's will that I do what I can to learn how. I must learn to share with others their joys, their sufferings, their ideas, their needs, their desires. I must learn to do this not only in the cases of those who are of the same class, the same profession, the same race, the same nation as myself, but when men who suffer belong to other groups, even to groups that are regarded as hostile. If I do this, I obey God. If I refuse to do it, I disobey him. Compassion teaches me that my brother and I are one. And he writes in another work called Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, written a few years later in 1966, I will be a better Catholic, because that is what in fact he had become, not if I can refute every shade of Protestantism, but if I can affirm the truth in it and still go further. So too with the Muslims, the Hindus, the Buddhists, etc. If I can affirm myself as a Catholic merely by denying all that is Muslim, Jewish, Protestant, Hindu, Buddhist, etc., in the end, I will find that there is not much left as a Catholic, and certainly no breath of the Spirit with which to affirm it. And in a letter to Czeslaw Milosz in 1962, he wrote, I cannot be a Catholic unless it is made quite clear to the world that I am a Jew and a Muslim, unless I am execrated as a Buddhist and denounced for having undermined all that this comfortable and social Catholicism stands for. So this Christian mystic picks up, you might say, not that he's intended to pick up on Martin Buber, but that thread that runs through I thou, that universalist thread, takes a more specific root in the hands of Thomas Merton, who understands universalism and the I-thou relationship as not only feasible but necessary, essential, if he is to be a better Catholic, and not just because, well, it's convenient or appropriate or politically correct to be accepting in some way, shape, or form of other forms of faith. Embracing them, understanding them. That word sympathy that he uses is, again, a Greek word. Sympathos means to feel with, and that's what he's talking about. When we come to the late 20th and early 21st century, one of the more important thinkers whose thought is available to us along these kind of lines is Fethullah Gulen, the Turkish Muslim who began life, as it were, as an imam, and who, over the course of time, in the 1980s and 1990s, and then, of course, since that time in the 21st century, has created a whole following, which is not what he intended to do. He just created a following because the ideas that he was putting forth generate following. And in his extensive writing, he combines a love of traditional Muslim thought with a passion for contemporary scientific thought, of intra-Islamic concerns with embrace of true interfaith dialogue. And one of the things that he writes about, this is about 20 years ago, is, and I'm quoting him, the goal of dialogue among world religions is not simply to destroy scientific materialism and the destructive materialistic worldview, because of course that could be the view of a mystic, could it not, that you should completely deny the material world? And he said, no, that's not the point. The point is not to deny the material world, not to deny the physical because of one's preference for the metaphysical, or the material because of one's preference for the spiritual. Rather, the very nature of religion demands this dialogue. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and other world religions accept the same source for themselves, including Buddhism. They pursue the same goal. It is, in other words, the case that there are an endless array of paths to the one in these different traditions. And Gulen was particularly, I would say, influenced by and connected to the thought of prior Sufis like Ibn Arabi and in particular Jalaluddin Rumi, who wrote in the 12th and 13th centuries respectively. Rumi, as I understand it, is read, his poetry, by more people in the United States than are reading any other text. That's up over. This is down under. The United States is up over. Although I don't know what we're over at this point. We have to get over what we're over. Anyway, but if you think about someone like Rumi or Ibn Arabi writing in the 11th, the 12th, the 13th centuries, when the Crusades are going on, when there are wars going on within Christendom, within Islam, and Rumi says, I go into the Muslim mosque, the Jewish synagogue, the Christian church, I see one altar. Or Rumi writes, not Christian or Jew or Muslim nor Hindu, Buddhist, Sufi or Zen, not any religion or cultural system. I'm not from the east or the west, not out of the ocean or up from the ground, not natural or ethereal, not composed of elements at all. I do not exist. I'm not an entity in this world or the next. This is God speaking through the mystic, which is to say, the mystic has been emptied of himself, or herself, in this case himself, and it is God itself speaking, denying the sectarianism that so often defines, and certainly in that era, and alas in our era, defines how we humans tend to think about our relationship to God. My way is the correct way. The whole point is that there is no single correct way. There are myriad correct ways for different circumstances, in different cultures, in different traditions. And Gulen writes, in the end, as we come together to fully recognize that goodness, beauty, truthfulness, and being virtuous lie in the essence of the world, and he's speaking about Rumi at this point, who had said continuously, become the light. Rumi promises this, Gulen writes, and then whatever happens, the world will one day find this essence, and no one will be able to prevent that is the shining of the light, the leading of the world toward perfection, from happening. He quotes Rumi, who says, come wherever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover, or of leaving, it doesn't matter. Come and join us, as we are the people of love, mahaba, devoted to God. Come through the door of love and join us, and sit with us. Come, let us speak one to another through our hearts. Let us speak secretly without ears and eyes. Like thought, let us see each other without any words or sounds. So it is very much in the mind of Gulen when he thinks not only about Rumi, but when he thinks about ourselves in our own time, is the ways beyond words that we need to be engaged. And so when he uses the word dialogue, which in common parlance English involves words, he doesn't mean to limit himself or ourselves to words. What evolves out of Gulen's thinking is far more than the words, although he has spilled thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of words onto the page of his writings and into the sounds of the tapes, which many people have listened to of his sermons over God knows how many sohbets over the course of the years, that it's not enough to have words. One has to have actions. And with that in mind, Gulen is emphatic in his writing and in his teaching about the need to be doing, and doing things not for oneself, but for others. Hence the term hizmet, which, as you all know, in Turkish means service. Serving others, not oneself. Gulen writes, even atheists are doing God's work when they do Hizmet. So they, without knowing that they are filled with God because they don't believe that there is a God, are yet by definition filled with God. And the reason, he says, is that if all of us are God-made, and I started out by talking about religion and this notion that fundamentally we are, then all of us not only have a bit of God within us, but all of us who would love God must love all of us, because not to would be not to love God, since God is present in all of us. And even those who don't believe that there is a God, if they do that, are doing that, even if they don't know it. But in those last words from Rumi, let us, if I can requote just for a second, let us see each other without any words or sounds, reminds us that one of the answers to the problematic question of how to engage with God when God is beyond words, when words are so much a function of the here and now and our reality, and God is so much beyond that here and now, beyond our reality, that one of the other options, of course, that humans have made use of over the course of the millennia, and we can trace this back as far as we can trace ourselves as a species, is visual art, is musical art, is dance, the use of the body. It's not just words. So from talking about Buber and Merton and Gulen, a Jew, a Christian, and Muslim, that must have been coincidence. I don't think I intended to do that. I would turn briefly just to three images that it seems to me particularly interestingly exemplify this issue. This first one coming from about 1961-62, so that's around the same time that the first quotes from Merton that I was reading were written. It's by an Iranian artist by the name of Charles Hussein Zenderoudi, Z-E-N-D-E-R-O-U-D-I, for those of you who are interested, and he is worth looking up. And it's called The Hand, or its subtitle is Sakakhane, meaning water fountain in Farsi. It is a work which operates on a double level simultaneously. So on the one hand, its title, and you can see this hand that dominates the image, draws both from the broad tradition that we are aware of, particularly within Islam, but actually goes all the way back to the pagan world of North Africa and the Middle East of 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, where the upraised hand stands in on the one hand for the God who is being addressed under some circumstances, and under other circumstances stands in for the priest or priestess who represents us with hand or hands, often two of them, upraised toward the God or the goddess in question. And that idea will continue to play through the visual art within the Abrahamic traditions, but particularly Islam, in the Middle East and across North Africa, so that what is in Muslim art referred to as a hamsa, which is this hand, of course, hamsa is just the Arabic word for five, as much as it reflects a long tradition, offers certain specifics that reflect on a specifically Muslim understanding of what the image of the hand is all about. So it does, of course, have five components, does it not? Like there are five pillars within Islam. And so it represents, in representing the five pillars, the relationship between a Muslim and God. And on the other hand, the configuration of the hand, as you can see, is that the thumb is separated from the other four. So in that sense, it also represents the relationship between the one God and ourselves, defined by a four-directioned reality, east, west, north, south, both connected to and yet disconnected from each other. God is both separate from, different from us, and yet connected intimately to us. So that hamsa idea is particularly present within the vocabulary of Islamic art, and will get picked up in the Middle East and North Africa, in Jewish and occasionally Christian art as well, from the influence of Islamic art. But secondly, within the specific context of Iran and its history, the hand is a reference to the most important moment in the aftermath of the beginnings of Islam. The Prophet, he dies in 632. he is followed by 4 followers, right? The Rashidun, the rightly guided ones. Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and the last, Ali, who is the founder, if I can put it that way, of Shi'i Islam, which is the official religion of Iran, going back as an official religion about now 8 centuries or so. And in the stories of the beginning of Shi'i Islam in Iran, the most powerful is of the Battle of Karbala in 680, so about half a century after the Prophet's death, in which the son of Ali, the grandson of the Prophet, Hussein, is engaged in a desperate struggle against the pretender Yazid I, who has established a new dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty in Damascus, and woefully outnumbered, and of course he is killed. But among those who perish with him is his half-brother Hazrat Abbas. And the story about Hazrat Abbas is that his hands were chopped off and he still kept going to the Euphrates River to bring water to his companions. And so he is one of the important martyrs in the context specifically of Iranian Shi'i Islam in its foundations. And his story is retold year by year and year by year and year by year. So this painting, it's not exactly a painting, it's a multimedia piece, done about 1961-62, reflects also on that story and was intended in part to be an implied political protest against the regime at the time, which is the regime of the Shah, whose regime was oppressive for most Iranians. So that part of this picture, as it were, is doing multiple jobs simultaneously. The backdrop gives you what is intended to look like, and it is actually the whole text of the story of Karbala in absolutely tiny, tiny, tiny Farsi against a gold background. And around the periphery, a kind of pseudo-Farsi inscription, so it presents a kind of Islamic carpet against which the hand is both the everyday hamsa, but also the hands, as it were, of Hazrat Abbas and the story of Karbala. But at the same time, the hand as a symbol of Islam is connected to the next symbol down, which is a 6-pointed star, which is intended to represent Judaism and the long Jewish history in Persia that goes back into the Judean period to the time of and after the Babylonian exile in the 6th pre-Christian century. And that is in turn connected at the bottom to a bowl of water, which at one and the same time represents the Sakakhana, the fountain of water that is a symbol of the martyrdom of Hazrat Abbas, but also the baptismal bowl of Christianity. So this work is intended to represent the 3 Abrahamic faiths within the context specifically of Iran and its history and its culture. And if we move the clock half a step forward, well, 30 years or so, to 1990, we are looking here at an enormous work by a German Christian artist whose name may be known to you by the name of Anselm Kiefer. Kiefer was born in 1945. German history in the 20th century is perceived by Germans the way it's perceived by Jews, to have a before and after. So before the World War II, before the Holocaust, after World War II, after the Holocaust. Kiefer is one of what would be called in German the Nachgeboren, the afterborn, because he was born exactly 1945 after. And he grew up in a Germany which until he was 17 or 18 years old never spoke about the Holocaust, never acknowledged it even happened, much less that Germany had had a role in it. So you can imagine that for a sensitive artistic soul such as his, at the age of 17 or 18 to come across the new historiography that told not only of what had happened during World War II that we call the Holocaust, but the role specifically that Germany had played in it, it was a rather shock to his system. And what's interesting about Anselm's art, really since that point, is it moves in many different directions, but one of the more intense ones, as a Christian artist, you understand, is that he becomes an absolutely fanatical student of Jewish mysticism. And within Jewish mysticism, one of the more intense moments is in the middle of the 16th century in Safed, which is today the Galilee in northern Israel, a school associated with a fellow by the name of Isaac Luria, And of Isaac Luria and his school of mystical thinking, there are two elements that I want to call to your attention that are relevant to this work. Element one is that Luria places an enormous amount of emphasis on what is referred to as tikkun olam in Hebrew, meaning fixing or repairing the world. The obligation of humans to make the world, to leave the world a better place than it was when we were born within it. It's an idea that had been floated loosely in the rabbinic tradition for centuries, but Luria really puts a huge emphasis on it. The other thing that I would call to your attention about his thinking is this. Part of what defines the focus for centuries of the Jewish mystical tradition is the question, how did God create the universe? How did a single God that is invisible, intangible, inaccessible to the senses create a universe that seems to be exactly the opposite of everything that God is? The universe is endlessly multifarious. The universe is all about the senses and the intellect. How did that happen? And the up to Luria standard understanding in the Jewish mystical tradition was emanation, that God from a central point, which is God itself, a pointless point, a point without dimension, emanates by way of letters and numbers to engender the universe. Along comes Luria and he says, no, 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 that's the wrong question really, and it's the wrong answer. The question is, how is there room for the universe, where God is everything and everywhere? That's the real question. And the answer to that question is contraction. The Hebrew word is tzimtzum. So God contracts itself into an infinitesimal point without dimension to leave room for the universe. And you can see up along the upper register that he has written the words in German, Z-I-M-Z-U-M, Tzimtzum is how that would be pronounced, to refer to that concept of contraction. But remember, he is a child in Germany, a Christian child of the post-Holocaust, and he also grew up hearing all kinds of anti-Semitic comments from his parents and their friends, but there are no Jews left in Germany. Why do they say all this stuff about the Jews? Why are they blaming stuff on the Jews? There are no Jews here anymore. So what is it there? The contraction, the disappearance, is about the disappearance in Germany of the Jews, who had once been, as he would come to learn, a very rich part of the very rich culture of Germany in the era leading up to the Holocaust. And it's also at the same time a question of the question, known as theodicy, which comes from two Greek words. Theos is God, dike is justice, the justice of God. Theodicy is a term that refers to the question of God's justice. If God is all just, all powerful, all knowing, all good, how does an event in which 1 million children are fried happen? And part of the answer to that question is that maybe that's the wrong question. God wasn't running the ovens. God didn't build the ovens. Humans did. Maybe the question is, what are we as a species? And with that in mind, if you look at this, the kind of horizon line, there's a little vertical, it looks like a tower. And it is intended to suggest in a semi-abstract manner the Tower of Auschwitz. And all those diagonal lines leading to it are to suggest in a kind of semi-abstract way the iconic image of the train tracks leading to the Tower of Auschwitz. And that brings yet another element into all of this, which is that he's an artist, but he's also aware of art history. And in art history, one of the defining features of the Renaissance was that artists became interested in and capable of giving you the illusion on a flat surface that you're looking through a window into space. And the one who articulates this is an Italian, a Florentine by the name of Alberti, who wrote a work in 1435 called On Painting, in which he talks about if you design your canvas with a horizon line, whether it's an exterior or an interior, it doesn't matter, and you contrive all of these diagonals, orthogonals as he calls them, leading to a central point from below and from above, which he calls the vanishing point, then your viewer will have the illusion that he's or she is looking into space toward that point and not at a flat surface. So he is also punning on that, all of those diagonal lines, those orthogonals, leading toward that tower image, are leading toward what in art history is a vanishing point. In the German and the Jewish experience of the Holocaust, as a kind of semi-abstract Auschwitzian tower is a different kind of vanishing point, is punning on the whole idea of God's contraction and God's vanishing, and the question of whether it's God or whether it's us. And then, of course, that large empty space just below that vanishing point is all dark. It's almost like, well, an artist's conception of what a black hole would look like, as physics understands it. The combination, therefore, of religion, of history, of art, of science is present in this multimedia work, which, of course, is on lead with ash and all sorts of other things. It draws from a range of different traditions, most notably the Jewish mystical tradition, and the artist himself, of course, is not Jewish at all, which leads me to one artist who is, and this is an artist by the name of Siona Benjamin. Siona grew up in India, in Bombay, and she was Jewish, sent to Catholic and Zoroastrian schools, most of her neighbors were Hindu and Muslim. So she grew up inherently as a kind of multiculturalist and multi-religionist, whether she wanted to be or not, and she eventually moved to the United States. She married a Jew from Eastern Europe. They were in the Middle West, they were in New Jersey, that's where she lives now. And her work invariably reflects the diversity of influences, religious and cultural, that are part of what make her. Every one of her works is every woman, and every one of her works is a kind of self-portrait. If you have met Siona, then you recognize that, wait a second, that looks like her face, and that's not accidental. She is all in blue, as it were, because on the one hand, that's a very common color used in Indian art, in particular with respect to Krishna and with respect to Krishna in his capacity as standing for what in Sanskrit is called bhakti, which is like the Arabic mahabba, love. And at the same time, she writes, this is in the 90s, and this work comes from about 2000 or so. In the 90s, she wrote, you know, when I first went to a couple of conferences, women's conferences, to show my art, and Western women would say, oh, you speak English? You're educated? That she was conscious of this kind of stereotyped assumptions about what she was because she was non-Western. And she said, I'd feel my skin turning blue. So the blue is part of a reflection on that as well. This is part of a series of what is referred to as fereshta. Fereshta is in Urdu a word that means angels. So all of these beings that are sent as intermediaries between God and ourselves to help improve the world, it's as if she has become one of them. And all of her work reflects combinations of influences and ideas. So you see this figure assuming with her feet the kind of pose that one associates particularly with Shiva in his capacity as Nataraj, the dance that both destroys and preserves the world. Her upraised hands, multiple upraised hands, reflecting again the way Shiva is often presented, but with the blue that more distinctly reflects on Krishna, and yet she is a figure who is both she and he, therefore. The hands rather, all terminate in what you can easily enough recognize as a series of hamsas, stylized. So instead of 4-1, you have 3-2, but that's not an uncommon stylization of the 5 that one finds in Islamic art. They terminate in very stylized candle flames, as it were. And there are 7 of them, such that what she has created of herself is a 7-branched candelabrum, the menorah, which is the quintessential Jewish symbol in art going back, roughly speaking, 2,000 years. So we have elements that can be identified as Jewish, as Muslim, as Hindu in this work. And inscription to the right and the left of the figure. The Hebrew says tikkun olam, the repair of the universe, that same phrase that I referenced a moment back in the context of Isaac Luria. And on the other side, you can recognize the writing. It's Devanagari. It's the writing that is used for Sanskrit. But she hasn't written something in Sanskrit. She's actually written tikkun haolam, but use Devanagari letters. So it is both the two sides that are Sanskrit and Hebrew and the one concept, which is the improvement of the world. So all of these artists, all three of them, and these works and many others that obviously I'm not showing you, and the three writers, the three philosopher, theologian, mystics from whom I quoted before turning to visual art, all of them share in common the idea that there are different modes and media through which and with which we can and must bring a world which is woefully imperfect toward a condition of perfection by combining forces rather than separating ourselves in sectarian ways. If the definition, you might say, of a prophetic figure is that, or one of the definitions, is that he or she becomes part of the process of joining with God and not expecting God alone to fix it all, then these are part of the ongoing process of that process, which is, can be, should be, must be as much alive in the early 21st century as ever it was 1,000 or 2 or 4 or 8 or 10,000 years ago. Thank you all very much.